Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Anton Warrenchuk in Baltimore. The bodies of 3 Israeli teenagers who disappeared more than 2 weeks ago were found in the occupied Palestinian West Bank. Here to give us an update from Jaffa, Israel, is Leah Tarachansky. She is a Real News correspondent reporting from Israel in the occupied Palestinian territories. She is also the director of the documentary On the Side of the Road. Thanks for joining us, Leah.
Thanks so much for having me, Anton.
So talk about the latest news that the 3 Israeli teenagers were found dead and what response we are likely to see from Israel in the next few days.
So 2 very significant things happened today. The first of which is that the government finally lifted the gag order on the Israeli press to reveal that the teenagers that they've been reporting for the last 2 weeks were kidnapped were actually dead. This is something that the government started leaking to the press almost immediately after the operation began on the 3rd day, but forbade the Israeli press from publishing it. Of course, without them publishing it, the foreign press couldn't confirm it. The second thing that happened today that was very important is that while all the turmoil was going on with the bodies of the 3 teenagers, which the government claims were found today, and of course the 2 weeks of bombardments of the Gaza Strip, the Israeli parliament passed a law today that would further entrench the Israeli occupation in East Jerusalem, making the division of Jerusalem in any future two-state agreement impossible.
Okay, and in regards to the Israeli teens, has anyone thus far claimed responsibility?
No, no one has claimed responsibility. From the beginning, no one has claimed responsibility. Meanwhile, the Israeli government, and especially the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, have insisted that it's actually the fault of Hamas. Now, this is very important because at every single point where he appeared into the press and in public spheres, he insisted almost in the same sentence that while the teenagers were indeed kidnapped, maintaining the line, they were kidnapped by Hamas. Meanwhile, when we compare this to every other incident that I've at least covered in my 5 years here, and speaking to many veteran journalists, if the government actually has evidence and if they want to push forward a line, they almost immediately after the incident release the evidence. Oftentimes the evidence is not truthful, and we at The Real News have often proven that, but still, they immediately, after a claim, release the evidence. Here, they didn't release the evidence, not immediately, not after, and not even now. Meanwhile, the Israeli Prime Minister continued to say that this is the fault of Hamas. Now, Hamas itself as a party didn't take responsibility for this. Not one of the many branches of Hamas, including the militant branches of Hamas, the Qassam brigades, didn't take responsibility for it. Neither did the usual suspects, the Wahhabis and the Islamic Jihad, nor did the Fatah's militant wing, Al-Aqsa. So as far as we know, none of the militant groups of the Palestinians have taken responsibility for it, but the Hamas party refused to condemn it. In fact, they've actually said that whoever did this, should be celebrated, which is what we would expect from a party that never gave up armed struggle. Fatah, on the other hand, the Palestinian party that's in charge of the Palestinian Authority, led by Mahmoud Abbas, has condemned the kidnapping almost on the 2nd day of after the incident, but failed to condemn the Israeli government and the Israeli military's numerous attacks on the Hamas party, including the arrest of more than 500 people in the last 2 weeks, the breaking into of 2,100 homes, the destruction of many of those homes, and the issuing of more than 100 administrative detention orders to Hamas members. Now, today, the Israeli Prime Minister issued the following statement in the press. Immediately after the abduction, we said that Hamas was responsible. I think that it is now clear to everyone what we based ourselves. Abu Mazen, which is Mahmoud Abbas, says that he opposes abductions. He says that he wants to proceed on a path to peace. If he stands by what he says, there's only one way to advance peace, and that is to tear up his agreement with Hamas. And this exactly is what this whole operation is about. The unity between Fatah and Hamas brought the latest in a series of political embarrassments to the Israeli Prime Minister, and he was adamant to break the unity between the 2 rivaling Palestinian political parties. Now, it looks like the rage on the streets, on the Palestinian streets in the West Bank, as we've covered last week, has turned against the PA, and the Israeli government and the Israeli military at the same time have been crippling the Hamas party. So we're seeing here both externally and internally, a rift between the 2 parties, which will likely lead to the end of the unity.
Okay, and just to remind our viewers, how have Palestinians been responding to the way the Palestinian Authority handled the crisis, considering the weeks of raids that the IDF conducted throughout the West Bank?
Yeah, so yesterday, former minister of the Palestinian Authority had stones and shoes thrown at him at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. We've seen the protests on the streets of the West Bank and Gaza against the way the Palestinian Authority has handled the situation. And as we reported last week, in the Jenin refugee camp in the northern West Bank, one group, the Al-Aqsa Brigade most likely, has actually opened fire on a PA security chief. And everyone I've been speaking to in my time in the West Bank has says that the rage against the Palestinian Authority has really reached unprecedented levels.
Okay, and do you think that Israel is going to intensify its military actions in Gaza?
We'll see. I just want to remind our audience that the rage is actually about the PA's coordination with the Israeli army. So all the while the Israeli army has been breaking into hundreds and thousands of homes, most of whom belong to Hamas party members, but also many others. For example, in the refugee camps around Nablus, anyone who spent any time in Israeli jails, which is 40% of the Palestinian males, for any reason at all, had their house broken into. Oftentimes they were beaten for no reason, sometimes beaten into a critical condition. And they just went door to door to door to anybody who's ever spent any time in jail. And all this time, the Palestinian Authority, of course, from pressure from the United States, has been coordinating with the Israeli army. And this is one of the main reasons why there's a lot of rage against them. Now, another very curious thing about this whole incident is if indeed the teenagers were kidnapped and killed or killed while trying to get kidnapped, why is the Israeli government bombarding Gaza for the last 2 weeks? Yesterday, they killed a senior official in the Hamas party, and as a result, for the first time since November 2012, since the last war we had here, the Hamas party launched a rocket against southern Israel. So we're seeing here that there's a very intentional campaign of agitation. There was one soldier who leaked to the Orthodox paper, the Khadrei Charedim, that there was actually snipers in the Jenin refugee camp who were trying to shoot people to instigate stone throwing. So we're seeing that the government is intentionally trying to instigate a third intifada, which will then legitimize a very wide violent campaign against the West Bank and the Gaza Strip.
Okay, Leah Tarachansky coming to us from Jaffa, Israel. Thanks for that update.
Thanks for having me, Anton.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.